My name is Shay Sullivan. I'm a linguist from the University of Colorado Boulder, where I'm currently getting my master's degree. I'm here to talk to everybody today about a linguistic intervention that I conducted last semester in my linguistics department. I'm hoping that everybody finds my presentation as a nice and warm follow-up to some of the discussions that we've had over the past 2 days. Also as a nice follow-up to RIVAS presentation. So just jumping in and getting started. The nature of linguistic intervention work is to educate people or specialists, intervention work in general, about a specific topic. This topic specifically being language revitalization and language revitalization efforts. And additionally, the goal of an intervention is to try to inspire professionals to engage in new behavior in their work, in the fields that they work in. So for my, intervention, we engaged in a 3-part series with a group of graduate linguists. They meet weekly. There's a bunch of linguists that meet regularly in this group. There are some linguists that come asynchronously as well. So it was a good group to target. I really wanted to target this intervention at linguists that are working with language in communities. And so yeah, it was overall a good group of people to target an intervention at. And so today I'm going to talk about the 3 sort of sessions that I engaged in, what was delivered, the goals that motivated these sessions engagement. And then this is also all very much in line with my professional development as a practitioner of ASLA. Great morning. So I went into this intervention with very specific goals in mind, many of which have been formulated by a lot of the frustrations that I've experienced in engaging with linguists in my field. And this is because the field of linguistics and anthropology, like Brian said in his last talk, has not always inherently been great to indigenous people. It's inherently a colonial field. And so just to give you a little taste of that, I showed Marie this photo on Wednesday. This was something that was written on a chalkboard when I walked into my classroom last week. It says the function of language is to control the universe by describing it. I don't think that I need to spend a lot of time picking that apart. It's inherently colonial, but I did want to just include it in my presentation as an example of the kinds of things that I see when I merely walk into a classroom, and the kinds of thought and ideology that I am constantly combating and feeling the need to decolonize and combat. I would also argue that linguists don't feel an incredible urgency in the context of language revitalization, and so I would say that if linguists feel entitled to describe every language in the world, they should feel equally entitled to a commitment to saving and helping people revitalize them. So additionally, my goals were motivated by a statistic that was presented in a work by Wesley Leonard that was published in 2020. For those of you who don't know who Wesley Leonard is, he's a member of the Miamia tribe, which has been widely known over the past couple of decades for their reclamation of the Miamia language and subsequent revitalization. And so he reported that from 2006 to 2016, there were 1,331 U.S. citizen and permanent residents that received a linguistics PhD from a U.S. institution, and only 10 of those individuals were considered Alaskan Native or Native American. This dearth is especially revealing when we regard the misalignment of a comparatively forward representation of indigenous languages in the field, where we even have demarcated specifications of entire language families, i.e. linguists will refer to themselves as Algonquinist, Athabascanist, and this is highly problematic because it allows linguists to assume authority not over just a single language, but an entire language family, and people who speak it. So these are the sort of goals of my intervention. The first of which was just to model ASLA to people in my department. Part of this is because there isn't an incredible amount of literature that's been published on accelerated second language acquisition, and there's a reason for that. It's an incredibly complicated and dynamic method of teaching language, and so if you were to publish a book on it, people would assume that you could get an answer to a problem by pulling that book off of the wall and searching through it. But a lot of the problems that arise in the classroom with ASLA are things that need to be worked out in workshops, which is why Dr. Bramer runs workshops. So yeah, I generally wanted to raise more awareness about Dr. Bramer's method. Additionally, linguists deal really only with the direct analysis of human language, so they're really actually pretty removed from language. They know little about language acquisition unless that's a specific area that they study or do research in, and they fail, or there are a lot of linguists who are monolingual, unfortunately, but the ones who are bilingual or speak multiple languages, they often fail to make insightful reflections about their own L2 learning experiences, in what I have experienced talking to other linguists about that topic specifically. And then aside from this, linguists know and they devote little time to knowing language as a dynamic force aside from analyzing it objectively, so they don't really know a whole lot about classroom pedagogy, language planning, immersion techniques. But there is a ton of time devoted to language documentation, description, and the creation of corpora. Moving on to goal number 2, I really wanted to engage my fellow linguists in my department in seminar-like discussions about what linguists can do and what it means to do meaningful language work in a community with low speaker numbers. I really began this discussion, or wanted to begin this discussion, talking about the sort of history of linguistics and how it's been inherently colonial and how it's not been incredibly good to the people that it has studied all the time. And then moving on from that discussion, I wanted to talk about what other sorts of things linguists, well, first of all, whether or not a linguist should be involved in a community that is working on language revitalization. And then if the answer to that question is yes, if a community is interested in having a linguist present, is it possible for that linguist to be a part of the community? And if not, what are other sorts of contributions that linguists can bring to the table aside from just directly analyzing the language that people study? So, for example, how can linguists be equipped with pedagogical teaching tools, project planning tools, language planning tools? Because these things are a lot more directly beneficial to community needs in the context of language revitalization. And then finally, I wanted to talk about how linguists, when working in a community, can help in ways that are not directly in line with training as linguists. So, in a larger work released by John Rayner and Louise Lockhart, who have worked very extensively in language revitalization, there was a woman, Margaret Spies, who worked under them, and she was doing field work in a very small language community in Arizona. And she found that it was most impactful and most beneficial for her to do work in a community that wasn't linguistics work. So she did a lot of work that was administrative work for people who worked in the language center so that they could participate in cultural and linguistic revitalization activities. She did a lot of babysitting. She did a lot of after-school watching for kids so that people who have other obligations in their lives can be focused on cultural and linguistic revitalization. And then lastly, I wanted to encourage and inspire linguists to kind of think about their work and how it could inherently be negative and how it could be modified or molded in some way to be more directly beneficial to language revitalization efforts. I found that most linguists are what Zuckerman in his 2009 revivalist work referred to as armchair linguists. So they sit at home and they analyze other people's language from the comfort of their armchair as if it's an intellectual puzzle that they can put together for fun. And additionally, I would argue that there are a fair number of what I have been referring to as helicopter linguists who drop into a community and extract linguistic data only to leave that community, publish work, and then it's always questionable what that work does immediately for the community, but it always forms the career of the linguist that works in that community. Right. So moving forward, just talking about session 1. In this one, I sort of laid preliminary groundwork for understanding who I am and my positionality, the work that I do. So I talked about my work as a practitioner of ASLA, a language learner of Arapaho, and a teacher of French through practicum. I talked about my research during my master's degree, and how I'm always feeling the need to combat colonial ideology and decolonialize this kind of thought in my field. This is also such the case that I actually applied to get my master's degree at the University of Colorado Boulder for a linguist who has done extensive research and work on Arapaho, and I have found my engagements with this individual to be incredibly disappointing, which is unfortunate, but it's also been a very, very good learning experience for me in a lot of ways. So then during this session, I talked about my time at the University of Montana, meeting Dr. Graymoring and learning Arapaho for 2 semesters. I spoke about how the relationships in my department with the fellow linguists that I was working with were incredible, and these were really good linguists that were really good role models for me, but that relationship shifted a little bit towards the end of my time at UM when I was completing the post-secondary certificate in language rejuvenation and maintenance under Dr. Graymoring. And then I shared a little bit of a history of ASLA, which we've already heard, and what it is. And then I talked about my different experiences, perhaps most importantly, my different experiences learning different languages. So my experience, I'm bilingual, I speak French. I also speak a little bit of German. Learning French and German for me was an absolute chore. I had to want to learn those languages far beyond just showing up to the classroom to learn language. I was married to my grammar books the entire time. I was married to dictionaries, translators, and this is only to find out that learning a language through print literacy or your first language doesn't equip you to actually speak another language. It only gives you tools to speak that language in the future if you want to. ASLA, on the other hand, teaches learners not only how to speak a language where acquisition comes first and it's exponential before learning the explicit grammar of a language, but it's been the most effortless, natural, and cognitively sound way of learning oneself in a language that I've experienced. Additionally, and most importantly, I would note that I have a lot of memories through my language learning experiences of French and German, where I felt bad about myself and my performance as a student. And this was sort of across the board in terms of grading, assessment, my interactions with teachers and students in the classroom, studying, doing homework. There were lots of times throughout those language learning experiences where I didn't feel good about myself and the work that I was putting in and the performance that I had. However, I can't say that I had ever felt bad about myself or had any sort of a negative experience learning Arapaho, because this method naturally instills positive learning qualities and subsequently instills positive learning experiences in students as opposed to a traditional classroom that can have some more nastiness built into it. So Dr. Graymoring and I might get frustrated at each other trying to get me to understand simple words like if, maybe, and the verb to hug, but the 2 language learning experiences are incomparable in that regard. All right. And then moving on to session 2, I actually used this session to demonstrate ASLA, and I taught a little bit of Arapaho. So it's worth noting first that this is on a much smaller scale than Dr. Graymoring does. He's been working with this method for his entire career. This is my first time ever using it to teach Arapaho, so it was on a really small scale, but nevertheless, I was really proud of myself, and it felt like a really good moment professionally to be able to command students in a rap poem space. So I taught the initial parts of skill set 1 and 2. This included 17 nouns and 15 sentences, which were learned in 20 minutes and then reinforced in the following 10 minutes. So that means that students learn roughly one thing. By one thing, I mean one image per minute. And this was structured not only to demonstrate how much language can be learned in a short period of time, but that I could move students from an immediate recognition of simple nouns to an immediate recognition of full sentences. There were also some students by the end of the session that were able to command singular and plural on verbs, and my professor was able to memorize, or not memorize, but had a couple of words for verbs in his head at the end of the session. At minute 30, everybody demonstrated about 80% cognitive recognition, and then at the end of the session, everybody was moving through the material very, very quickly, and it seemed kind of redundant to keep working on that, so I stopped the language teaching at that point and moved to a little bit of a discussion. This is a timeline of the class in session 2, where I prepped everybody for the first 10 minutes. We learned language for the next 20, which was reinforced in the next 10 for a total of 30 minutes, and then we had a 20-minute discussion. This is just a visual of the errata that was learned or presented. And then in session 3 was the big sort of like reflective session where I, wanted to ask people thoughtful and engaging questions about their work and what was presented and how that stuff sort of fits into the context of language revitalization. So the first thing that I sort of began this session with asking was, what does language revitalization mean? What does that mean to you? What does it mean to others? What does it mean to linguists? What does literature say about it? One participant suggested that she was under the impression that a corpus would need to be collected in order to save a language. And this gave me a perfect opportunity to talk about how this speaks highly to the material reality of linguistics, where linguists love to render books and things that are tangible and publishable for the field in the form of grammars, dictionaries. This is much how Alicia Edwards was talking about on Wednesday, how there are different kinds of heritage, this sort of physical and non-physical heritage that we can talk about, and linguists love to take that non-physical knowledge heritage and turn it into a physical book in some kind of way. Like I said earlier, these works always forward the career of a linguist, but it's questionable what they do for communities. Additionally, languages are spoken without linguists, so it takes a little bit more than just putting a bunch of data down on paper and analyzing it. And then I went back and I returned to some more discussions from session 1 about Margaret Spies and the work that she did in her little language community in Arizona, doing babysitting work and admin work for people so that they could focus on cultural and linguistic revitalization activities. And then sort of for the last question here, I was motivated to ask people if they are currently engaged in work that is directly beneficial to language revitalization. The answer to that was no, of course. But I found this intervention to be really positive and impactful in the sense that all attendees were very open to and intrigued by the thought of having other skills as linguists that they could provide to communities and people under their belt. I also had a lot of attendees that have been emailing me and talking with me since my intervention about getting more literature that they can read on decolonial thought theory methodologies. I did use quite a bit of that stuff in that literature in my talk and presentation. And so I have 2 attendees who primarily work in education. They're linguists, but they primarily work in education, and they train higher education educators in different pedagogical teaching methods and how to create equitable classrooms. So these two have been very much pressing me about where they can get more information about what I delivered during this time. So ultimately, I didn't get to cover everything that I wanted to, but I believe that I achieved the goals that I wanted to. And then I definitely think that looking forward, more intervention work like this should be carried out in spaces where professionals work in communities that they don't know or fully understand. We very much need more of a representation of Indigenous people in anthropology, archaeology, those fields in general. But in terms of creating paradigm shifts in the field that we're already operating in, we're not going to be able to change entire demographics of the field, so it's important to be able to create spaces and situations where we're having conversations and getting people to think about new perspectives. I think that there's a certain sensitive way that we can do that because we're not just constructing or combating constructs of coloniality and power. We're combating deep contemporary constructs of American whiteness as well, North American whiteness. And so I found that softly introducing work and community-driven work like this is really impactful and motivating to people. And that's pretty much my presentation. These are my references. I wanted to say thank you to everybody for coming, and I wanted to extend also a big thank you to my mentor, Now, who's done a lot for me over the past few years.